All right, so tariffs, right? Remember all that talk about tariffs a few years back?
Yeah, it seems like it's back in the news again.
It's back, and this time with, like, a new twist.
Oh, what's that?
This thing called the External Revenue Service, the ERS.
I've seen that popping up.
You sent us a ton of stuff about this, articles, videos, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, there's a lot out there.
So former President Trump, it looks like he's really pushing to bring this ERS back.
Part of his economic plan, I think.
It's like a key part of it, yeah. So for everyone listening, we're going to break it all down for you.
Sounds good.
What it is, what it's supposed to do, how it works, and what it could mean, you know, for your wallet at the end of the day.
That's the important part.
We've got articles from Fox Business, Reuters, some opinion pieces, even some YouTube videos.
Some pretty strong opinions out there, too.
Yeah, for sure. So to kick things off, let's just, like, define what this ERS is.
Okay, so former President Trump announced it on his social media platform, Truth Social. And he wants to create this new agency to collect tariffs, duties, like all the revenue that comes from foreign sources. And, you know, his claim is this is going to force other countries to, quote, pay their fair share for trading with the U.S.
Interesting. Okay, so this is where my brain is a little fuzzy. Because doesn't the U.S. already, like, have a system for collecting tariffs?
Yeah.
I'm confused. Like, where does this new ERS fit in?
Yeah, so right now we have U.S. Customs and Border Protection,
Right.
CBP. They handle all the tariff collection.
Yeah.
So the ERS would be, like, taking over that.
Wait, so we'd have two government agencies, like, doing the same thing?
Essentially.
Doesn't that seem a little redundant?
Well, yeah, and that's what some experts are pointing out. Like, why do we need this whole new agency?
Right.
When we already have one, and it seems to be working, so there's a lot of debate about that.
Okay, yeah, I can see why. And here's, I think, where it gets even more interesting. The name External Revenue Service.
Right.
It makes it sound like the money's coming from outside the U.S. But is that really how tariffs work? Like, who's really paying for this?
Right. Yeah, that's where the messaging gets a little tricky. Technically, U.S. importers are the ones who pay the tariffs. They pay them to CBP when the goods, you know, come into the country.
At the border.
Yeah. But economists are really emphasizing that that cost doesn't just disappear, right?
Right.
Like it gets passed on ultimately to American consumers through higher prices.
So it's not really external revenue at all, is it?
Well, that's what a lot of people are saying.
It's more like American consumers are the ones who might be footing the bill in the end.
Yeah. Some sources are even calling it like a marketing gimmick,
Wow.
you know, to make it sound like it's coming from outside the U.S., when really it's not.
Okay, so let's break this down, like, in a real-world example.
Okay.
One of the YouTube videos you sent used a really helpful example with, like, Apple importing a product from China.
Right.
So walk me through this. Like, if the U.S. slaps a tariff on that product, what happens next?
All right. So let's say Apple is importing the newest iPhone from China, and the U.S. puts a tariff on it, like, say, a 10% tariff. There are a few different things that could happen.
Okay.
One, China could decide to lower their prices
Okay.
to kind of absorb that tariff, you know?
Okay, so, like, they eat the costs.
Yeah, they eat the costs so their products stay competitive.
So that would be good for American consumers, right?
Yeah, because they wouldn't necessarily see a price increase.
On their new iPhones. Okay, what else could happen?
Well, China could say, no, we're not changing our prices.
Okay.
And then Apple's costs go up by that 10%, and they're probably going to pass that on to the consumer.
So then that new iPhone just costs 10% more.
Exactly.
And the American consumer is feeling it.
Right.
Okay, are there other scenarios?
Yeah, there are a couple more. Apple could decide to absorb the cost themselves,
Okay.
but that would probably hurt their profits, maybe impact their stock, dividends, things like that.
So then investors are feeling it.
Right, exactly. And then the final scenario is, you know, Apple says, forget this, we're moving our manufacturing out of China.
Back to the U.S.
Back to the U.S.
Yeah.
Which would, you know, boost domestic industry.
Yeah.
But it'll probably mean higher prices for consumers too, because production costs here are higher.
Okay, so it's like this chain reaction.
Yeah.
It's like who ends up eating the cost?
Exactly. And that's where this ERS comes in. It's designed to, like, frame this whole narrative around tariffs in a certain way, focusing on external revenue, but not necessarily being upfront about all these ripple effects and who's really paying in the end.
So it sounds like it's more than just about collecting tariffs. Like there's a deeper message they're trying to get across.
Definitely.
It's about perception, right?
Yeah, shaping how people see it.
So it seems like the ERS is trying to send a strong message, but, like, is it all just for show?
Well, a lot of economists are, they're sounding the alarm, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And for good reason.
Hmm.
Increased tariffs often lead to higher prices for consumers.
Right.
And that, can contribute to inflation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And we're already seeing some inflation worries, so it's kind of,
Adding fuel to the fire.
Exactly, yeah.
Higher prices on everyday things, that would really hit people's budgets.
Yeah.
Are there, other economic downsides?
Yeah. So economists are also worried about retaliatory tariffs.
From other countries?
Yeah. So, it's kind of a tit for tat.
Yeah.
One country raises tariffs, and then another country raises tariffs.
Back and forth.
Yeah, and then pretty soon, you've got a trade war, basically.
Okay, so, everyone loses in a trade war.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, trade wars disrupt those global supply chains.
Right.
Which means businesses face higher costs, and there could be shortages of materials.
Right.
Consumers might see even higher prices and fewer choices.
Okay.
So it just creates a lot of uncertainty and volatility.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. So if the economic risks are so high, why are we even considering this ERS? What's the, political angle here?
Well, a lot of people see it as a way to appeal to a certain segment of voters.
Okay.
People who feel like the U.S. has been taken advantage of in trade deals. So it pushes this tough-on-trade image.
I can see how that message would be appealing to some people.
Yeah.
But would a trade war, also hurt American businesses and workers?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Seems kind of counterproductive.
It is. I mean, a trade war would likely lead to job losses, in industries that rely on exports or imported materials.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's definitely a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
And that's why it's such a divisive issue.
Right.
You have very strong opinions on both sides.
Speaking of those strong opinions, some of the stuff that you sent me is, pretty critical of the ERS.
All
And they're
right.
calling it, more about optics than substance.
Yeah.
Just a rebranding of, the same old tariff policies.
Yeah, that's a common criticism. Senator Ron Wyden, for example, he's been really vocal in his opposition.
What's he saying?
He actually called it a multi-trillion-dollar tax hike on American families,
Wow.
disguised as getting tough on foreign countries.
Oh, okay.
So his argument is, tariffs end up hitting consumers the hardest
Yeah.
because it's like a hidden tax that drives up the cost of living.
So it's don't be fooled by the name.
Yeah.
It might sound like it's targeting those foreign entities, but it's American families that might end up paying the price.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, there's another layer of criticism, too.
What's that?
Some people say, this whole ERS thing is a distraction from, the real issues, the root causes of trade imbalances.
Right.
Like currency manipulation or unfair labor practices in other countries.
Right.
And so instead of addressing those, the focus is just on collecting more tariffs,
Yeah.
which,
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg.
yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. And, with all this debate, there are still so many unanswered questions.
Right.
How would this actually work?
Yeah, how would it function?
Which specific tariffs? What's going to happen to the existing trade agreements that we have?
Right.
Big questions.
Yeah, huge questions.
It feels like we're just, scratching the surface here.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more to unpack, especially with the potential long-term consequences.
Yeah.
But before we go down that rabbit hole, I think it's important to consider, what are the alternatives?
Okay.
If the goal is to address trade imbalances and create a more level playing field, are there other ways to do that besides tariffs?
I'm all for exploring other options, for sure. Tariffs seem kind of risky, so what are those alternatives? So, okay, we've talked about the potential risks, of tariffs and this ERS.
Right.
But what are, some other approaches to trade policy that, maybe would be more effective and less disruptive?
Yeah. Well, one approach that a lot of people are talking about is instead of, these sweeping tariffs
Right.
or creating new agencies like the ERS, what if we just strengthen the trade agreements we already have?
So work within the system instead of reinventing the wheel.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And proponents of this approach, they argue that the U.S. should focus on renegotiating those existing deals,
Okay.
to address specific concerns, make sure things are fair.
Okay.
For example, there's been a lot of talk about, updating NAFTA,
Oh, yeah.
which was renegotiated a few years back.
I remember that. There were concerns about jobs moving to Mexico, and how that would impact American workers.
Right, exactly. So, one focus of these renegotiations could be to include stronger labor protections, environmental protections,
Okay.
just to make sure that, everyone's competing on a fair and sustainable basis.
Right. What about things like intellectual property theft? I know that's been like a big issue with China.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, making sure that American companies, their innovations are protected, that's crucial.
Yeah.
So renegotiated trade agreements could include, stronger enforcement mechanisms for that,
Okay.
dispute resolution processes, just like better ways to tackle these things head on.
It sounds like more collaborative,
Yeah.
but is that going to be enough, to satisfy the people who really feel like the U.S. has been getting the short end of the stick in trade deals?
That's a good question, yeah.
Yeah.
Because some people argue that just like tweaking the existing agreements, it's not enough
Yeah.
to really address those fundamental trade imbalances. They say you need a more assertive approach, like the ERS.
Right.
So it goes back to that debate about, is tough on trade really effective? Or is it actually counterproductive?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why it's so important to think about those downsides,
Right.
of any trade policy, whether it's tariffs, new agencies, or renegotiated agreements. We have to think about the long term and weigh those costs and benefits.
Okay. So that's like strengthening existing agreements is one option.
Right.
What else is out there?
And then another approach that's getting some attention is focusing on boosting domestic industries
Okay.
and making the U.S. more competitive from within.
So instead of trying to like control what's happening in other countries, we focus on making things better here.
Right, yeah. And that could involve, investing in education and job training,
Okay.
making sure American workers have the skills they need. It could also mean, like, investing in infrastructure, like roads, bridges, broadband internet.
Those investments would have like benefits beyond just trade.
Right,
It
absolutely.
would improve like quality of life for everyone.
For sure. And this approach could also include incentives for businesses to invest in research and development.
Okay.
So we can foster innovation, create new industries that can compete globally.
So it's a longer term strategy,
Yeah,
but maybe like more sustainable in the end.
yeah, that's the hope. It's about building that strong foundation for growth and competitiveness instead of relying on those protectionist measures,
Right. Which, might backfire.
Exactly.
So this has been like incredibly insightful.
Oh, good.
I feel like I have a much better understanding of like how complex this whole trade policy world really is.
Yeah, it's definitely complicated.
But as all this stuff plays out, what should we be looking for? Like, what are the red flags?
Well, one big thing is how other countries react
Okay.
to what the U.S. is doing, especially if they go ahead with this ERS.
Right.
Will they retaliate with their own tariffs?
Right.
Will we see a trade war? Like, these are the questions that could really impact, the whole global economy.
Yeah, like a big game of chess, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We need to be thinking several moves ahead.
For sure. And another thing to watch is how the political debate evolves, especially as we get closer to the next election.
Right.
This is going to be a hot button issue.
It's going to be big, yeah.
And it's important to, pay attention to what the candidates are saying.
Okay. So basically you're saying, like, be an informed voter.
Yeah.
And hold our elected officials accountable for the decisions they make on trade.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And beyond just voting, there are other things you can do.
Okay.
You can contact your representatives.
Right.
Let them know what you think about this ERS, tariffs, any trade stuff that you're concerned about.
So don't just like sit on the sidelines and complain.
Yeah, right.
Get involved.
Exactly, yeah. Join advocacy groups, go to town halls.
Right.
Talk to your friends and family about it.
Right.
The more informed people are, the better.
Yeah. This whole deep dive has been like eye-opening for me, for sure.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that.
I feel like I've learned so much, and it's definitely given me a lot to think about.
Well, that's the goal. Trade policy can seem really daunting, but it really comes down to people's lives,
Yeah.
how they're living, how they're making a living. It affects us all.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, to all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.
Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep those questions coming.
Absolutely, yeah. Because the more we learn and discuss this stuff, the better decisions we can make together.
Well, that's it for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.